And as we're trying to figure out the impact of this potential trade deal, Batya, I want to come to you first, because we think about the last time Trump made a deal with China, and granted, things got a little crazy. You had COVID and then a turning over of the White House. So if he, in fact, is the enforcer, he wasn't necessarily able to enforce then. And I'm thinking specifically about our agriculture products and soybeans that they were supposed to take. I saw this news this morning that a deal was done in principle, and I thought to myself, this is positive, but can we trust China?
We absolutely cannot trust China. I do think this is very positive. Us coming out of this with a 55% tariff on them and then with a 10% tariff on us, that's really good. The thing that I think is extremely important to note here, President Trump mentioned in his tweet that we will be allowing Chinese students to stay in American universities. This was obviously extremely important to Xi Jinping, whose own daughter matriculated from Harvard. And I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind for the future. This is something China is absolutely committed to. We learned from the Wall Street Journal that the CCP sees Harvard as the party school. Now, I'm not saying that it was wrong of President Trump to cede that in order to get a better economic deal. That might have been the right thing for now. But going forward, wow, is that something we should keep in mind as a real leverage pressure point on China?
Yeah, Brian, can we talk a little bit about some of what we gave up, what they gave up? Sure. Batya mentioned a couple of points, but ultimately at the end of the day, to me, it seemed like a fair negotiation in the sense that both sides did give something up.
Well, I think you make the key point, which is let's see who gives what and who gives up what.
In actuality.
I mean, Batya, I like what you said about I get really nervous about the student thing. I think that is one of their main sources of espionage, China spying on the U.S., and they're doing it through the students at American universities. Everybody knows our American universities have sort of been the R&D, one of the R&D hubs of America. China knows that, which is why they want their students there. We don't even have to talk about the fungus from last week that students brought to the University of Michigan, which could wreck crops across the Midwest. I don't like that. Maybe it is fair, though. Maybe you're right. Maybe that's okay for now. I also don't like China wants the semiconductor technology. And I get your point, Taylor, about it being, well, it's the older model technology. Fine. But they want it because even with the older technology, they can reverse engineer what they're finding in NVIDIA products, and it helps them build their own better state-of-the-art chips. Does that mean that the president shouldn't have cut this deal? I don't think so, because I think this is very short-term. I think what the president wants is access to the rare earths that China dominates now, because our defense industry needs it and our auto industry needs it. But I also think the president continues to have us on a path where he is saying, if you count on China now, you should not do so in the intermediate term and the long term. Find another way. So to me, this still feels like a
transition
duct tape deal.
Okay.
Because we're not, ultimately, we want to pull that duct tape off at some point and get away from China, because if you think you can trust them, you're kidding yourself.
I think that's an important point, but I also think we are where we are right now. As I watch the market reaction to this, markets are higher, but they're not, popping champagne, Taylor. And I think to myself, that's because we've been moving steadily higher in anticipation of this. So a lot of this has been baked in the cake. If Trump didn't deliver, the markets actually would be disappointed. Brian talks about the semiconductors. He talks about the rare earths, which you've talked about a lot. Those have been negotiated, at least for now.
Yes, I'll address both those points. I love that you talked about the markets, because I think slowly but steadily, blink and you miss it, we're only 100 points shy from a record on the S&P 500. The record was a 61.44 mid-February. We are almost there. So this has been a slow grind higher, climbing that wall of worry. But effectively, we're there. Why? It could be because are we being held artificially higher by low interest rates? No, because the Federal Reserve isn't lowering interest rates. So that leads me to the null hypothesis, which is it must be based on fundamentals. As we know, the markets are thinking 6 months out. What do earnings look like? Earnings were good. They were up 15% last quarter, year over year, which means the tariffs haven't really impacted them. They haven't impacted margins, and we'll talk about this CPI report later. They're not impacting prices that people generally are paying at home, which leads me to think that companies in the markets are thinking that things are good in the future. And that's where I bring up my chart of the day for you, Jackie, which is after a 1.5 standard deviation shock event, and this time in 2025, we'll call that shock event Liberation Day, the markets 2 months later have never been stronger than they are now. On average, 2 months later after a massive shock going back to 1950, markets generally are still down 10%. We are up. We are having the best recovery ever after a major shock event. So this tells me that the markets are reading through this, and the fundamentals, frankly, still look good. For the rare earth metals, and I don't want to hog all the time, great op-ed in Reuters, I believe it was, talking about how there are certain auto companies that are trying to get away from rare earth magnets and rare earth minerals. Not easy, not overnight, but Japan's Nissan Motor did an EV in 2012 with 40% less. Renault did it, developing an alternative motor without permanent magnets. And so there are some ways where we can't control China's supply, but we can control demand. And if there's ways that smart, innovative companies can start to get away from this, that loosens the chokehold that China has on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if that's why China was like, hey, auto companies, we'll give you our rare earths. That was a couple of days. I wonder if they were looking at people getting away from rare earths and saying we better keep them at.
I love the premise of innovating around it and finding alternatives. Jerry Taylor brings up a great point, and I loved her chart of the day today to show us how much the market has rebounded, and it has. And so we're very close to that all-time high again. That makes investors nervous, especially with no good news, pending anymore on the horizon. What's going to give us that next leg to go higher?
Well, that's a great question.
Do we go down from here? I'm not saying down substantially, but do we go down and back off a little and bounce around?
Well, if I could predict the markets, I would be sitting on my own private island, out in the Caribbean somewhere. I think what's so interesting about all of this is that the markets have been willing to look through a lot of it and say, we're going to wait until we know something, which is exactly what we're doing today. My read of today's action was, we're not really believing it till we see the paper itself and see what's being given and what's being taken away. So they're in prove it to me mode right now, a little higher, not a lot higher. Oh my gosh, what happened to the Dow there? Oh, 92.
About 100.
I read that wrong.
Don't panic, Jerry.
I'm not panicking. Yeah, and no panicking. Right? They're not panicking, and that's good news. But are we going to get to this World Bank story? Because I'm so excited about that.
Yes, I'm sorry. I got so excited about China, I forgot that, because now the World Bank is getting behind Trump's tariffs. And when I read that, I was like, holy smokes, since when is the World Bank ever on the same page as Donald Trump?
So we need to go and buy a box of those Trump was right about everything hats and send it to the World Bank economists, because they're saying that he is right on these issues, that in fact, the playing field was not even for the US of A, that this kind of thing had to happen. You're seeing the New York Post here. World Bank agrees with Trump's trade complaints, urges countries to lower tariffs. What world are we living in? Sometimes you wake up in the morning, you read the paper, you think, really? Is that what people are saying?
That wasn't on my bingo card.
No, me either.
But can I point something out? Did you catch this? This was in Steve Moore's report. We're funding the World Bank this year at a tune of $3.2 billion, which was this was in the big beautiful bill budget, okay? And actually, so as Steve Moore points out, if you're not a fan of the World Bank, you don't love that we're funding the World Bank. But it kind of doesn't surprise me that the U.S. is paying some of the big bills for the bank, and the bank says, oh, so we like your economic policy. It's a little... I would just actually like to say goodbye, World Bank. Myself, I'd like to say goodbye, World Bank. But it sounds like kind of counterintuitive to what Trump usually does. We're giving him a lot of money.
Yeah, well, we do foot the bills for a lot, and still, for some reason, we don't always find that there's consensus when it comes to Donald Trump or what he's trying to do in the United States. So it's not just the World Bank, but I hear you on that point. I feel like you wanted to say one thing.
Yeah, I want to make two brief points. The first is Trump has not just been right about this since Liberation Day or since Inauguration Day. He's not just been right about this for the last decade. He's been talking about tariffs and these unfair trade deals for 40, 50 years, right? He's been right about this for a very long time and been trying to get to a position where he could make a difference for the American people since he ran for office. And so it is so gratifying to see the recognition of what we've all known was the truth, which is that the tariffs did not have a negative impact in the way that was being said. The second thing I'll say is I think President Trump wants two main things out of this administration. He wants a roaring economy that lifts all boats, especially the plight of the American working class. And he wants the Nobel Peace Prize, which I feel he was very unjustly deprived of after the Abraham Accords, which was a historic peace deal in the Middle East. And he feels like I think he's trying to get the Saudi normalization deal. People keep saying to me, they'll never give it to him. And, I hear that. But looking at this, looking at the World Bank recognizing that they were wrong about tariffs, that they were wrong about his economic agenda, I do feel that he is starting to get that recognition that he deserves when, the entire expert class was so against him from the get-go.
I hear you. I'm not going to hold my breath on that. And I'll just close up this conversation
Could be wishful thinking.
on China by adding my own 2 cents, which is I still wonder what enforcement is going to look like here. The nuts and bolts feel good to me, but I'm worried about fentanyl. I'm worried about intellectual property. I'm worried about spying and espionage, all the intangibles that we were talking about from the get-go. Do these numbers and the mechanics of the deal financially get China to toe the line more with respect to those issues? Will Donald Trump be able to hold Xi Jinping and hold his feet to the fire? Because that's really how all this started. If you remember, the tariffs started because he was angry about an open border and he was angry about fentanyl. And then it's ballooned into a much bigger thing. So we will see. And as always, we're keeping an eye on it.